Very important influence on Jackson. Frank Mott, you can almost tell, was a devilish character. He was a distant cousin by marriage, late in life, of his widowed mother, to a distant relative of Jackson's mother. So they were tangentially in-laws, but Jackson's father did not think much of Frank Mott. Jackson's mother thought he was okay because Mott was always nice to his mother. And Frank Mott was a lawyer. Frank Mott was a Democratic politico. Frank Mott was an orator. Frank Mott was a wheeler-dealer. And Frank Mott was a great charismatic figure who captured the imagination of Jackson and took him under his wing as an apprentice. After that Jamestown High School year, Frank Mott brings Jackson into the office for reading the law, age 18, age 19. Mott is partners with this fellow. And maybe I read too much into the photos, but a little devilish and a little mature or cerebral or restrained. That's what they were as a partnership. This guy was a great scholar, Benjamin Dean, a great reader, a careful writer, a professorial temperament. Frank Mott would make noise in courtrooms before juries and win big verdicts and live a big lifestyle and travel around doing political missions and run for statewide office and leave excitement but wreckage in his wake. Ben Dean would hunch over with his pen and carefully write briefs and read his Blackstone and tutor and work young Jackson. And both of these formative influences are part of the training. This is the principal of the Jamestown High School, Milton Fletcher. He served for decades in that position and took a shine to young Jackson when he spent his postgraduate year there, 1909, 1910. And pulled him out of regular classes and started to tutor him in specialties like economics. Jumping ahead, Robert Jackson in 1943 writes Wickard versus Filburn, a landmark Supreme Court opinion about the breadth of the Commerce Clause. It's a unanimous decision upholding a piece of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It's the homegrown wheat case, and farmer Filburn, who was fined for growing too much wheat, even though he was just feeding it to his family and his animals. And that case went to the Supreme Court. He said, you can't constitutionally, you Congress can't constitutionally regulate me at home for what I do and penalize me for just being myself in private. And Robert Jackson writes an incredibly astute, brilliantly correct, in economic circles, uncontested theoretical opinion for the unanimous court, saying, withholding demand from the market is economic activity just as much as taking products to sell in the market. Self-satisfying demand withdraws demand. And that leads to price collapse, and that affects what Congress has the power to regulate, the market of interstate commerce. It's sort of like not having health insurance, just deciding, I'm going to be healthy. I'm never going to get sick. And if I do, I'll just show up in an emergency room, and then the rest of you will get stuck with that bill. It's inactivity, some might say. 5 Supreme Court justices, for instance. Smarter Supreme Court justices, Ruth Bader Ginsburg writing for the 4 of them, would look at that and say, didn't you read Wickard versus Filburn? Don't you understand economics? Don't you understand that Wickard versus Filburn understands economics? She doesn't refer to this, but don't we see that Milton Fletcher taught Robert Jackson economics? And to his credit, Chief Justice Roberts, one of the 5 in the healthcare decision a year ago, does say, in his opinion, because Justice Ginsburg has just punched him to a bloody pulp in her dissent, okay, economists might say, in other words, every economist in the history of economics would say that supply and demand are both economic activities, whether created or withdrawn. But the framers of the Constitution were practical men, etc., etc. And then Roberts kind of goes off and avoids the point. In other words, he's saying the framers were too dumb when they wrote the Commerce Clause to understand economics, so they really only meant activity, not inactivity. I must say. And Robert Jackson learned that in Jamestown in 1910. But this is the hero of the formation story. Mary Rosina Willard, an English teacher, a spinster, if I may say so. This is a photo about 1875. So by the time she was Jackson's teacher, she was an older woman and lived with her sister in Jamestown. Her sister taught in the middle school and Mary taught in the high school. They both taught writing and literature courses. And Jackson answered a question early in the semester in her class with a reference to something that he had read, not assigned by a Frewsburg teacher, on his own, probably out of a public library. And she said, "Robert Jackson, how do you know that?" And he said, "Because I've read Alexander Pope." And she said, "Meet with me after class, please." And she probably asked where and how. And then she realized that she had something here that was special. So she did this. And he saved this piece of paper for the rest of his life. Reading course in English literature, recommended by Mary R. Willard, 1910, property of Robert H. Jackson. And it's a mimeographed 6-page list of great works in English literature. The top items, a little hard to read here, include Adkins, Aldrich, Browning, Bochum, Manning, Revell, Burns, etc. And it wasn't just a list. It was a shared project that Mary Willard embarked on with Robert Jackson. Not in the class. The class was doing what the class was doing. After school, after hours, one-on-one, tutorial. Where? After all, he lived down in Frewsburg. He commuted by trolley to Jamestown. In her living room. How do I have a picture of her living room? Because I took it a couple weeks ago. It's a standing house in Jamestown. It's now a community development agency. And behind the chair is an old fireplace. And on the mantle of this fireplace is an old nameplate, Bohemia, which is what Mary and Vesta, her sister Willard, called their home. And in front of that fireplace, 100 years ago, into the wee hours of the evening, they read aloud. Usually it was a quartet. A fourth person joined young Jackson and the Willard sisters, and Jackson started to bunk in with them. And words and expression and beauty and learning was a fuse that was really lit out of that fireplace by Mary Willard. Jump ahead to Nuremberg. Jackson's closing quotes beautifully from Richard III. That's his absolute final passage of his closing in July of 1946. He didn't have the collected works of Shakespeare with him at Nuremberg. He had memorized at least pieces of Richard III, thanks to Mary Willard, and drew on that as a felicitous way to draw the principle of accountability to an eloquent close at Nuremberg.
That these defendants now ask this tribunal to say that they are not guilty of planning, executing, or conspiring to commit this long list of crimes and wrongs. They stand before the record of this tribunal as blood-stained Gloucester stood by the body of his slain king. He begged of the widow, as they beg of you, "Say I slew them not." And the queen replied, "Then say they were not slain, but dead they are." If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say that there has been no war, that there are no slain, that there has been no crime.